everyone. This is Dave. Happy Monday. Hope you had a good weekend and maybe enjoyed the launch coverage of Rocket Lab's 59th launch. Today, we have a lot of Rocket Lab updates to go over, so let's not waste too much time. But before we get into that, I hope you will consider hitting that subscribe button if you are a new viewer and you do find this interesting. To all my returning viewers, thank you so much for continuing to watch. And I do have a couple new channel members I would just like to thank for joining the squad. We have Rosa B rejoined, as well as Dawn McClellan, Viking Leong rejoined as well. Recognize that name. So thank you guys for continuing to support the channel and what I do here. Okay, with no further ado, let's dive into this week's Rocket Lab updates. Starting off with the stock, as always, looking to be a pretty strong day today, up over 6%. So you love to see it on a Monday morning. A little bit of a flat few weeks, though, overall, still completely fine with this share price range. We're looking at 29-ish. And personally, if we can establish a base around these levels, any kind of base around 28, 29, I would love to see that as a new kind of line of support. So looking pretty good for the stock price right now. Okay, on to the news. First of all, of course, we did have a successful launch by Rocket Lab on Saturday, and the coverage was really top-notch and on point. So if you watched that, I'm sure you noticed as well, really great stuff. The IoT for You and Me mission lifted off from the launch complex in New Zealand on February 9th, successfully deploying 5 satellites to 647 kilometers low Earth orbit for Kinéis. This was the 4th launch for them to date and the 59th Electron launch in total, getting close to that exciting 60 launch. And crazy enough, number 100 doesn't even seem that far away at this point. CEO Sir Peter Beck said that that's 4 launches done and still 1 to go for Kinéis. Then we'll have deployed their entire constellation in less than a year. It's not uncommon for constellation operators to wait longer than that for their first launch, let alone have a full constellation deployed and operating in under a year. So great stuff from Kinéis and Rocket Lab. Rocket Lab also shared the launch date for the 5th and final Kinéis launch in this series of missions will be announced in the coming weeks, so we can expect that relatively soon. As well, the launch date for the next Electron mission is scheduled for liftoff in February, with the specific launch window and customer details to be announced in the coming days. So a bit of a slow start with no launches in January. Glad we finally have that first launch in the books, and hopefully the team can accelerate from here. I do believe they still have several scheduled for Q1, so we're really looking for them to accelerate on that number they had last year and hopefully get into the 20s is what I'm hoping for in 2025, but we should get some more information on that with the Q4 earnings call coming up in a couple weeks. There was some more new information from Rocket Lab's launch coverage. Let's check out a couple things they shared with us.
Neutron's launch mount was installed ahead of the first launch, and you can really see the sense of scale from the people standing nearby versus Electron's launch mount next door at LC2.
Other recent additions to LC3 include 2 enormous LN2 vaporizers. These will be used to supply gaseous nitrogen for the vacuum and environmental conditioning system for Neutron when it's on the pad. And with that, the large infrastructure items are done and dusted at LC3. Now it is a case of connecting all systems together and running them through a vigorous test and commissioning phase as we count down to Neutron's inaugural flight later this year.
This image of Neutron, which, I don't think a lot of people noticed, but you have to get up pretty early in the morning to sneak anything by. Rocket Lab retail investors and, of course, several community members were extremely quick to point out the discrepancy here and the confirmation that Neutron has indeed gotten larger. So if we go over to this image I made demonstrating the difference, we have on the right from this February 2025 launch coverage, Neutron now standing at 45 meters tall, whereas in September 2022, the height was 42.8 meters tall, meaning that Neutron has now stretched or gotten taller by 2.2 meters. Obviously, there's a few different things this could mean. First of all, perhaps there are some performance issues, could be Archimedes, could be elsewhere. Maybe some things were weighing more than they expected. It's hard to say for sure. And they're just compensating for that by making the rocket a little bigger to still accommodate the same amount of payload in terms of weight and payload volume space to hold that. Another possibility is perhaps the capabilities have increased a little bit and they're going to be able to launch a little bit more payload to orbit. Of course, this would be the more exciting option. We did see in a update not too long ago from Rocket Lab, which I shared in a previous Rocket Lab updates segment, that Archimedes is now 200 kilograms lighter or less mass per engine. And obviously there's a bunch of these on the rocket. So that could have a significant performance boost for the rocket. And hopefully as this engine continues to iterate and improve, that will continue to drop. So maybe that could be a point in favor of, increased capacity for Neutron, but you never really know. Now, if we actually go all the way back to a Neutron updates video I did a while ago, you may remember that I said the second stage tank they had shared a video of was also looking stretched, looking bigger. And now this makes a lot of sense. If that first stage overall rocket is also stretched, that second stage being stretched to be bigger really fits in better, meaning there shouldn't be, loss of room for payload and, the performance should line up there. So things are starting to make a little bit more sense as we've seen that larger second stage as well as now the first stage confirmed being larger. Very interesting stuff. And no big announcement, it just kind of slid in there in the coverage. So thank you to the keen-eyed observers like Captain D2 who pointed this out incredibly quick. Next up, we have an announcement from MDA Space, the Canadian company, which does impact Rocket Lab significantly. So MDA Space announcing this $1.1 billion contract with Globalstar to build their next-gen LEO constellation. Interestingly enough, this is not being subcontracted out to Rocket Lab for their buses. MDA Space is using their own MDA Aurora software-defined digital satellites for this Globalstar constellation. Why this matters for Rocket Lab is that if we go back to my tweet a while ago in November, I tweeted out some potential catalysts that I thought could be coming for Rocket Lab stock, and we knew that Globalstar was going to have a expanded constellation. Those were going to have to get built by someone. Rocket Lab is working on their current satellites, so it seemed reasonable that there was a chance Rocket Lab would get a big order of Globalstar satellites. Turns out this is not the case. So now we can go ahead and cross out that potential catalyst for Rocket Lab. A little bit disappointing, not shocking. I did have the potential probability as medium. So I would have liked to see at least some components getting ordered from Rocket Lab, even if they weren't delivering the full buses, maybe Star Trackers or Solar or something like that. But MDA announced their subcontractors and Rocket Lab was not to be found on the list. So bit of a disappointing news item there. Also, since we have the catalyst up, I did just want to highlight that it's not looking great for the Mars sample return mission either, because they announced, well, really a non-announcement, but NASA did say they're leaning towards either the Sky Crane technology from the original Perseverance rover mission or potentially a heavy lift rocket like, say, a New Glenn or Starship. But Peter Beck, continuing to advocate for Rocket Lab's solution. This Space News article saying a missing link is that Mars Ascent vehicle, that small rocket, or MAV as they call it. And Peter Beck saying, not too sure that's really a missing link. We could be pretty good at making small rockets. Obviously, lots of experience with Electrons. So nice to see that Peter is still advocating for Rocket Lab. I don't think he's fully lost hope that they'll land this mission. Obviously, with the new administration coming in, things could still get shaken up there. Now, speaking of that Mars sample return mission, we did have a very interesting podcast where both Peter and Richard French, who is a Rocket Lab, I believe, VP or senior VP and a very smart guy, did talk about their proposal for that mission. So if you want to hear more depth and more details on Rocket Lab's proposal, as well as, just discussion of how commercial can fit into these planetary science missions. It's really a good listen, but it is a long one, about an hour and 20 minutes. There was one interesting piece that Richard French said here, though. Let's listen to this briefly together.
We sell spacecraft buses, and we're a prime contractor for end-to-end missions. And so, we've got 43 satellites in our production backlog right now. If you come and visit us in Long Beach, you'll see a clean room full of satellites being integrated. If you go to any of our factories, you'll see a ton of hardware in process for delivery to customers. And so
the interesting thing here is that Richard said 43 satellites in the backlog for Rocket Lab. And why this is interesting is because they've just delivered a couple satellites for Varda recently. So there's some discussion about whether this is news that maybe they have a new satellite contract and that has kept the number at 43, or whether Richard is just using the current number that was publicly given by Rocket Lab, the most recent number, which was 43. But you would think, since they had delivered a satellite since that 43 number was last said, and now that it should be at 42 or 41 even, and he's still saying 43. So maybe we have some news in the earnings call of another new satellite contract, or maybe he's just going with what's said previously and didn't want to, change any disclosures on a forum like this. Let me know what you think. If you agree that maybe we do have another satellite contract coming, I would be happy to see it, obviously. Next up, not a huge news item here, but Rocket Lab is powering the Blue Ghost lander for Firefly in a lot of ways with their Max Flight and Max Ground software suites. And Firefly Aerospace did announce that Blue Ghost has now completed its trans-lunar injection burn, or basically merged onto the highway to the moon, as Firefly says, instead of orbiting Earth. So they're now beginning their 4-day transit to the moon, and very exciting times for the Firefly Blue Ghost lander. Good luck to you guys on the mission. So far, overall, it's looking quite good. Rocket Lab also highlighting that they have now powered 1,100 of the most iconic space missions with their solar solutions, and they are providing solar as well to Blue Ghost. So nice getting that recognition for Rocket Lab on the work on the Blue Ghost lander. Next up, Peter Beck did speak at a recent smallsat convention. Now, we don't have publicly shared video of this talk, but there's been lots of quotes thrown around. And Peter Beck did say some interesting things at this conference, as well as some other people talking, the industry in general, and there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. So a couple things I just wanted to highlight that Peter was quoted as saying is that the default situation in satellite manufacturing is that there are lots of opportunities. 300 spacecraft is now a small number, and large constellations are the default. Very general statement, but I think this is good for us to remember, especially in light of that MDA Globalstar expansion not going Rocket Lab's way. There's lots of opportunities out there to build out new satellites. He also talked a little bit about constellations and applications and what Rocket Lab might get into, or not really Rocket Lab per se, but just the state of play for the constellation and space application market. He said that my view of some applications is that Earth observation is pretty much done. He said the race has kind of been run there. The demand keeps growing, but you don't see a whole bunch of new EO businesses emerging. You have Planet and, Spire, a few others there, but the market hasn't grown as rapidly as a lot of people expected for Earth observation. Communications, to my mind, is all about internet and direct to device, but it is a hard place to be. I would just interject here. This is me speaking now, not Peter. A lot of people thinking that this would mean Rocket Lab is ruling out communications. I wouldn't say that. Rocket Lab does lots of hard things. So just because it's a hard place to be doesn't necessarily mean Rocket Lab won't be pursuing it, although some people did read it that way. Let me know what you think down below. He continued on with the usual speaking line that the big space companies of the future are end-to-end, and this means launch, spacecraft, and applications. These are going to be the behemoths. Will they be space companies or satellite companies or an application company? And the lines will get blurry. I think you're already seeing that with SpaceX. They're almost turning into a telecom as well as a space company. And I do think Peter sees Rocket Lab as being one of those behemoths of the future, one of those big space companies of the future. So we do know they're going to move into applications, but just another talking point and something to speculate about when we discuss where Rocket Lab is going. I do think they're looking for increased government business as well, and maybe something in communications that doesn't compete directly with Starlink. He also predicted that maybe a couple rocket companies would fail in 2025. I had to think about relativity when he said this, but let me know if you're thinking of someone else. He also said Mars is going to get a lot of attention with this new administration, and said that the opportunity is endless. There has never been a more exciting time in space, and that he is super bullish. So very exciting to hear him say that about the future of the space industry, and bullish for Rocket Lab as well, of course. A few more quotes is that he said most people thought this would be the end of small launch, talking about transporter and these new and bandwagon and these new rideshare missions. But in fact, it wasn't. Small launch has continued to grow, and every year we sign more deals, also saying that small launch has kind of been solved and Electron's filling that niche nicely. He also talked about the upcoming and emerging super heavy vehicles, obviously New Glenn and Starship. He says they're great for particular purposes, but they don't solve every problem, comparing them to passenger jets versus smaller aircraft, saying that there's still need for those smaller aircraft and there will still be need for smaller rockets in the future. Super heavies are going to be amazing for interplanetary and a whole bunch of cool stuff, but I don't subscribe to the view that they destroy all launch. Obviously, Elon saying that, Starship will basically do everything in the future and that it'll be so cheap, there's no need to launch anything else. So going to be interesting to see how that story plays out, which view is true, and if SpaceX really does pivot hard away from their Falcon 9 rocket and only go big. Okay, continuing on. As I talked about the potential stock catalysts recently, we have another one to discuss here with the star next to it. So unfortunately, Mars sample return looking bad. New Globalstar order can be crossed off the list. But we do have the SDA Tranche 3 contract awards coming up this year, and there's a lot of stuff to talk about for that. Obviously, this will be massive. Rocket Lab already received a $500 million contract for Tranche 2, keep in mind. So now Tranche 3 is the next tranche in that constellation. We do have a draft solicitation released from the government on Tranche 3. And a couple things I highlighted are that the government intends to make 2 awards of 20 vehicles each. Now, this is interesting because there was more than 2 awards for Tranche 2, and it was spread across several different providers, Rocket Lab, Sierra Space, several others. And I guess there'll be less winners this time around, but more vehicles each. So could be good, could be bad. I think competition will be fierce, and I do expect Rocket Lab will be a bidder on this tranche. I'm not even going to bother saying the long acronym, will include optical communication terminals to support in-plane and cross-plane crosslinks, links to terrestrial OTCs, which is ground, air, and maritime, and crosslinks, satellite vehicles external to the transport layers. That was a lot, but basically these are optical laser links that need to be on the satellites. They need to be able to communicate with other satellites in the same kind of orbit, as well as higher orbits or lower orbits, as well as ground stations. Now, the reason I highlighted this is because Mynaric, a company in Germany, recently was announced that they are expecting to file for bankruptcy very soon, running out of cash. Things are looking bad. Again, they did secure a bridge loan amid restructuring, but things are still looking very bad for the company. Why do we care about this? Well, if we look at Rocket Lab's subcontractors announcement supporting their current constellation, we do have Mynaric as the provider for optical communications terminals for aerospace mobile applications. Clearly, this is being highlighted as a requirement for SDA and is a big deal. So if this provider is going through bankruptcy, having all sorts of struggles, not even delivering very well for layer 1 and 2, there was a lot of news articles around them delaying layer 1 and stuff like that. So this is a big question mark. What happens with Mynaric? And will that cause problems for their current $500 million constellation that Rocket Lab is working on building out? Will this cause problems for future tranches? Is it potentially an acquisition target for Rocket Lab? They do have a ton of debt as well. I think Germany has some pretty strict rules about German companies being bought by companies from other countries. And especially when you're in aerospace and defense, that can be a little bit tricky. So you never know. But it is, something that's very important that we should keep an eye on for the future, what's happening with Mynaric and these optical communications. Continuing on, Trump did announce recently a Iron Dome for America in a sweeping missile defense push. Why does this affect Rocket Lab at all? Well, he wants to accelerate development of defenses against hypersonic weapons. And if you want to intercept a hypersonic missile, you kind of have to go hypersonic yourself. Who is testing out lots of hypersonic technology right now? It is Rocket Lab with their HASTE program. We have seen a big uptick in demand for HASTE, and that seems like it's set to continue. I could only imagine that this is bullish for Rocket Lab's HASTE program. And the more you read about HASTE, the bigger and bigger it starts to sound, especially when you talk about that Kratos big billion plus, I think it was $1.5 billion contract that Rocket Lab is a partner on. I do even wonder if you could potentially see HASTE missions outnumbering orbital missions one day on Electron, because I really think HASTE will grow rapidly. And this is just another indicator in that direction. So I do have to say, though, just from a personal note here, I don't like putting weapons in space. And yeah, the most contentious elements of this is that it's directing Department of Defense to pursue space-based interceptors, which are weapons positioned in orbit to destroy incoming missiles. I understand why you'd want to do this, and maybe it's easier to launch being in space already and go down and intercept those hypersonics. But I think the more the US puts weapons in space, clearly China, Russia, and others will follow suit. Not to say they're not working on that already. It's just, I don't know. I just don't want to see space becoming like nukes up there everywhere. It's just, yeah, I prefer space to be for non-military, but maybe that is a little bit of a naive position because Russia and China are going to do it regardless. So the US needs to do it. Let me know if this bothers you as well, or how you feel about it, if you'd like to continue that conversation down below. Overall, though, I do think it's just another data point that sounds good for HASTE, although nothing firm here in terms of new HASTE contracts. Finally, I did just want to point out that Peter Beck did another very long podcast and interview. If you're interested, now this is more about Peter himself and his history, his upbringing, his family, his thoughts. If you want to learn more about the guy running the company, it is worth a listen, but nothing, material specific to Rocket Lab and what they're doing right now. More just about his thoughts, his philosophy, and if you really want to get to know the guy, then this is a good listen. Okay, that is all the Rocket Lab news I have for you today. Hopefully we can see those Electron launches continue to increase in cadence, and really excited to see the changes in Neutron, as well as opportunities for Rocket Lab out there with those government contracts. A little disappointing, of course, with Globalstar, but those things happen. Let me know what you think about any of these news items down below. If you haven't subscribed, I hope you'll consider doing that, and those likes and comments always help as well. I hope you guys have a great day and a great rest of the week. I'll see you very soon for the next video. I have an exciting interview. Can't wait to bring you guys. Bye for now.